Hello there. This video has 3 parts. In the first part, I will go over opinion polls conducted in Russia by the Levada Center. In part 2, I will look at some of the social and economic indicators that might be behind the ongoing support for Mr. Putin's government. In the third part, I will look at legislative action taken against culture and media freedoms in specific, passed since the early 2000s. My code to scrap and analyze the data is on GitHub, along with a full list of references. Links in the description below. Approval ratings for Mr. Putin have been as high as 83% since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. The September data shows the first wobble in opinion polls, but the full effect of mobilization will fully show up in the October data, and I will publish updates then. Mr. Putin's approval ratings have been high since his first term as President of Russia in 2000. The graph shows a downward trend emerging in 2009, but this goes into reverse during the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. This pattern repeats at the beginning of the second invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I know what you're thinking. The people cozy up to the West, approval ratings go down, let's invade Ukraine. But just because things happen in close proximity, it doesn't mean there is a cause and effect relationship. As we have 2 comparable events, we can look at how approval ratings behaved in 2014 and 2022. Approval ratings for Mr. Putin are high in 2014 and 2022, but there is no dip in September 2014. The approval ratings for the government overall are lower, but the trend itself mimics the president's. In both periods, positive attitudes towards the US and the European Union, or EU from now on, decline. However, in August 2022, these recover slightly, which did not occur in 2014. If we zoom out, there are a few interesting dips in attitudes towards the EU and the US. And if I add some historical context to the graph, then I can say that positive attitudes dip when the EU and the USA do something that Russia does not like. For example, allowing the Baltic republics to join the EU, or criticize Russia for military action in Chechnya, Georgia and Ukraine. This August slight recovery in positive attitudes towards the US and the EU may just be a blip, but if it is coupled with a dip in approval ratings of the president and the government, it could be a signal that underlying sentiment in society is changing. The Levada Center conducts opinion polls on a number of topics, not just the ones I mentioned so far. In this graph I have the results of a selection of the questions that they ask, which are aimed at getting an insight in people's feelings, hopes and expectations for the future, as well as their attitudes towards the state. The graph, although a bit messy, helps us in gaining an intuition of the Russian Zeitgeist. At the beginning of the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, the opinion polls' responses crystallized in an upward trend of support for the government. This pattern repeats in 2022, but it is sharper and tighter. Sanctions were imposed on Russia in 2014 too, but they do not appear to have had a negative effect on opinion polls. The responses do not start to diversify until 2016, and approval ratings do not decline until 2018. I would link this decline to domestic matters. For example, in 2018 the government proposed a very unpopular increase to the retirement age, forged ahead with changes to the education system which reduced teaching of all languages, this includes minorities' languages, to 2 hours a week, or simply attempting to ban the very popular messaging app Telegram after ongoing protests against corruption in public office. It helps to have some context to better understand the longevity of the current regime in Russia. The GDP has been growing since the early 2000s. This graph is of absolute values. The next graph charts the rate of growth. There are a number of dips, but overall the economy in Russia has been relatively good. This has enabled the government, with the big G, meaning the state as a whole, to implement measures that have improved the standard of living of the average Russian. The poverty rate overall has been on a downward trend since the early 2000s, and the Gini index, which charts wealth inequality, has trended down towards a more even distribution of wealth. Expenditure on the healthy sector has increased year on year. Alcohol consumption has been declining, slightly. The homicide rates have declined quite dramatically. These trends translate into positives in people's lives. Looking at inflation since 2012, it has been below 10%. It shot up at the time of the first invasion of Ukraine and now in 2022 during the current invasion. The value of the ruble against the dollar declined after the 2014 invasion, but has remained relatively stable since. The indicators I have selected here create an image of stability, and in context, even the hike in inflation in 2014 and 2022 and the relative weakness of the ruble are not dramatic. If I zoom out to the 90s and look at inflation and the value of the ruble then, the situation is very different and frankly terrifying. Russians saw everything they had evaporate while not knowing that whatever they had left will be enough to survive from one week to the next. The 90s have left deep scars in the Russian collective mind, and it might go some way in explaining the trade-offs in personal liberties that have been made since. For the economists among you, I have scrapped the data for the first and second quarter GDP growth from Rosstat, the Russian Office of National Statistics. I have aligned the former to the World Bank's own and tucked it in red at the end of the GDP growth. Please note, this graph is somewhat misleading. The Russian economy is highly seasonal. Stability comes at a cost, especially in Russia. Freedom of the press has had a checkered history in Russia, as the chart shows. Being an independent journalist in Russia is still a dangerous profession. However, since the early 2000s, the strategy to control the information flow in the country has changed from targeted to the far-reaching, both in terms of topics and people. The government has been passing laws aimed at stopping ideas or information that it considers harmful to the Russian people or undermining of Russian values. To appreciate when this legislation is passed, we need a bit of historical context. This timeline shows both conflicts Russia has been involved in and terrorist attacks it suffered since the 2000s. The bar chart shows when laws were passed and acted upon. There is a flurry of activity around times of war. These type of laws are very rarely repealed, and they tend to build up over time. The overall effect is to reduce cultural freedoms. Additionally, there is a dramatic shift in 2022. Up to this year, breaking any of these laws was an administrative offence. Breaking the law would result in a more or less hefty fine. But since the beginning of this year, it became a criminal offence, punishable with a lengthy jail term. Earlier in this video, I used this graph. But if I added in what I would loosely call the censorship events line, now the consolidation of trends after February 2022 can be better understood. If I zoom in with the monthly results, it is possible to spot the September wobble again. In the next couple of months, it should be possible to see if this is just a wobble or the beginning of a trend. Thank you for staying with me this far. As I mentioned, all my code and the source data is on GitHub, as well as a full list of references. Please see the links in the description below. If you have any questions or would like me to look at other data, please leave a comment below and I'll try my best to answer. Please like, comment and subscribe if you wish. All the best and take care. Bye bye.